Oh, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And we are currently enjoying a beautiful February here in Danville. Certainly not what I was expecting from the way January went weather-wise. Um, I've been able to get out and be walking these last few days. It's quite lovely. This is Midday with Reverend Don. Welcome, everyone. As you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can put your comments or questions into whatever platform you may be watching this on. They will show up here in my chat room, and we can communicate directly. My subject for today is friends on the other side. And you might say, how did I come to this subject? Well, I've talked about it a few times. Hello to Michael in the chat room. It's good to see you, Michael. In my career in the pagan world, I've known a lot of people who had strong influences on my personal career and on my life, many of whom are now among the ancestors. And every now and then I like to talk about some of them. And I thought today I would talk about both some of those who are well known, who have influenced me, and some that you most likely will never have heard of. And hello to Mary in the chat room. Hello to Janet in the chat room. Um, but first, I want to thank Chris Copeland for having joined us yesterday. Hello to Renee in the chat room to talk about Corellian publishing. We have a lot of interesting things coming from Corellian publishing in the future. We were talking about some works for children that are in current development, Reverend Don's Book of Astrology in current development. And we're also talking about bringing back the Tarot of Hecate in the near future. Um, Although that's still being put together, but watch for more details here on Corellian TV as we bring out new and interesting products through Corellian Publishing. For me, I am in an interesting position in that my associates were always much older than myself. Um, Earlier this week, I was celebrating my Sapphire anniversary, and hello to Nikki in the chat room. And Nikki gives us greetings from Tulsa. Welcome, Nikki. 45 years as first priest of the Corellian tradition, now a year into being retired in office. But obviously, that means I was very young. Um, and hello to Christine in the chat room. And Christine says it's so interesting your topic as her good friend's wake is today. And, that's an interesting piece of synchronicity. Um, because I started my career so young and advanced so quickly, the people that I was working with were in every single case almost older than myself in the early years. Lady Crystal, my teacher and my counterpart in the first priesthood, 18 years my senior. Lady Bitterwind, 18 years my senior. Every single person in the Corel Mother Temple and the Dancers of Shakti Temple, at least 10 years my senior. And all of those people now, except for Lady Crystal and myself, are among the ancestors. I've spoken at some length about Lady Bitterwind. I'm not going to talk about her again today. But she obviously was one of the people who had a great influence on me, who is now among the ancestors. But as I started to move out into the wider pagan community, this was still the case. When I was working in the pagan press for many years, the people I was working with as editors and artists were mostly 10 to 20 years older than I was, some of them significantly more than that. And therefore, the people I thought of as my friends, my contemporaries, were not in my own age group. And that puts me in the position, even though I'm not really all that old, of being in that point where I often read about my friends in the obituary column, and have now for a long time. Many people I considered myself very close to have been in spirit in some cases for many, many years. And, this is something that causes you to be reflective on your own life, your own legacy. Um, I think in some ways, just the position I've been in already made me that way. But watching so many of my friends cross over and seeing how history has treated them has been instructive, and something very worth talking about. So today, um, I'm going to talk about some of the prominent people I've known in the pagan community. Um, I think every one of them I'm going to talk about was prominent at one time, at the time that I knew them. And, some of them you may well still know. Others you will not have heard of. Um, and I'm going to start with the two most prominent who are very well remembered. Um, and they're people I've spoken of on occasion, but I'm going to speak of them today. Pete Pathfinder Davis of the Aquarian Tabernacle Church. At one time, we were very close associates. We spoke frequently by the telephone, which will tell you just how long ago this was. Long before there were things like cell phones. This was the 1980s. And among people that I would consider a mentor, Pete is very, very highly placed. I learned a great deal from Pete. Pete was a fascinating man. Some years ago, it was remarked to me that he was a very irascible man. And, I did not remember him that way. But in looking back, yes, he was. Just not really with me, because, I was basically learning from him. Um, and so I was certainly not arguing any points. I was listening, which was the wise thing to do with Pete, because he knew exactly what he was doing, more so than almost anyone else I've known. He had a background in politics. He had held elective office. He had been a lawyer. He had a tremendous amount of practical knowledge that he used in building the Aquarian Tabernacle Church. And I learned a great deal from talking to him about these things. And when I first started interacting with Pete, it was just after um, the establishment of the Aquarian Tabernacle headquarters in Index, Washington. And one of the earliest conversations we had that I recall was his telling me how, when they first moved in there, he had made it a point to go and introduce himself to all of his local neighbors. Hello to Jason in the chat room. Good to see you, Jason. And he didn't go and introduce himself to them as Pete the Witch. No, he just went and introduced himself as Pete Davis, your new neighbor. And he allowed them to get to know him as a person before they found out about the Aquarian Tabernacle Church and his role in the Wiccan religion. So that by the time that they were learning this, they already knew him. And this is the kind of thing that Pete specialized in. Um, and it's part of what made him so very successful. It's one of the most successful of all Wiccan leaders I have known. And um, being able to learn from those experiences was extremely valuable to me. Hello to Kai in the chat room. It's good to see you, Kai. Another thing that Pete talked about, Pete was among other dignities that he held. He was a member of the Washington State Interfaith Council and eventually the president of the council. But he talked about how when he first applied to this council, there were people in the local Wiccan community who objected to his being there and tried to prevent the council from accepting him on the premise that he could not represent the entire Wiccan community. He couldn't represent them. Of course, he wasn't there to represent them. He was more there to represent the Aquarian Tabernacle. But anyway, he told the story of this meeting. The council gave them a meeting to come and make their objections. And he said he was very nervous. He didn't know if they were going to reject him because of this. And he came and he took his place and he saw his opposition come and he watched the council. And the opposition started making um, their objections in relatively emotional terms. They were all dressed in complete black and lots of silver jewelry and a very Gothic type of look. He was sitting there in his tweed jacket with the leather elbow patches, and he said he could see the members of the council, just going like this, looking from the objections to him, to the objections to him, and he knew within a few moments how they were going to decide, because his opponents, who didn't want him there, had not considered their audience. They hadn't considered how they were going to present their message. they had just kind of run on emotion. And he knew the council was going to accept him as being more of the sort of person that they were able to work with, and they did. And eventually, he became their president. This is very valuable guidance to me as a young person. And there were many things that I learned from Pete Pathfinder. Um, and of course, the Aquarian Tabernacle is still one of the most successful pagan churches in the United States, now headed by Belladonna Laveau, who has been a very worthy successor to Pete Pathfinder, which is saying a great deal. Um, and I have to say that in safeguarding the legacy of Pete, she has done a very good job. And this is, I think, a wonderful thing. So, among the people I'm going to mention, Pete is one of the ones you're most likely to know. Um, Second person I want to mention is Olivia Robertson. Olivia Robertson was one of the founders of the Fellowship of Isis, which is a goddess-oriented organization. Uh, have many pagan members, but would not necessarily describe themselves as a pagan organization. In fact, specifically did not. Um, and hello to Jan in the chat room. It's good to see you. But had many pagan members, and they also had members from other religions who were there to recognize the divine feminine in their religion. There were people, are people in the Fellowship of Isis, which certainly is still running, who considered themselves good Catholics for whom the divine feminine was Mary. There were people from other religions as well. The fellowship did not care what religion you came from as long as you honored the divine feminine in one way or another, and were on the same page with their ideals. Lady Olivia, I never knew the other founders of the fellowship. They died before I would have any chance to meet them. They were Olivia's brother, the Baron Robertson of Strathlock, and his wife, the Baroness. Um, and um, the Baron died, if I remember correctly, either right before or right at the first modern Parliament of the World's Religions some 30 years ago. Um, and after that, Olivia was the last of the co-founders left, and she continued onward for many, many years. She was in her 90s when she died. So she was 78 when I first met her, if I remember correctly. And I had the great honor of getting to know her and learning a lot from her, both by watching and from direct communication. Um, and she gave me one of the greatest compliments I've ever received. She said she was always happy to see me because um, basically I was always happy when we encountered one another. I was always positive, and I think that was a great compliment. Lady Olivia, I've often remarked that one of her big points she liked to make to people is that she hated when people talked about the good old days because she'd been alive in the good old days, and frankly, they weren't for most people. Yes, for her family, they had been good. They lived in a castle. They had lots of money. They were titled aristocrats. Most other people in the part of the world she lived in were quite poor, and she loved the change that had happened during her lifetime, in which the middle class had been able to move forward, in which many people had been able to improve their positions, and wouldn't want to see it go backward for anything. And I've always thought that was very instructive. And I love history. I love historical movies and programs. I love historical everything. But I'm mindful of the fact that while I might enjoy Downton Abbey, I would not have been living in Highclere Castle were I living in that era. Um, and if you're not living in the castle now, you would not have been living there then. And if you really want to understand history, you should look at what your own lifestyle would have been. It wouldn't necessarily have been terrible, but it is unlikely to have been in the castle, unless as one of the servants. Um, And this was one of the points that Olivia would make because she came from a background where she understood that. Olivia was a very interesting woman. She was related to Robert Graves and a number of other prominent people because they were a very prominent family. Um, though she had some very different opinions than, for example, Robert Graves. She had a vast education, a very classic education, and very well versed on classical paganism, paganism of the ancient world. And this very much infused the Icean liturgy. But the thing about Olivia that was most remarkable, in my opinion, is how positive she always was. Even on those rare occasions when she wasn't, she still, for the most part, was. It was even if she had to say something negative, she usually kept it in the most positive way she could do it. She was very much a person who encouraged others, who built others up, and this was a very important thing, in my opinion. Now, she was also a political leader. She understood the position she was in. I've heard her described as a daffy old lady. In fact, Pete Pathfinder described her as giving the impression of being a daffy old lady, and she was nothing of the sort. She did give you the impression of being a kindly great aunt who would pour you a cup of tea and discuss the weather and so forth. But she knew exactly what she was doing. She was very intelligent, and she had great political acumen. And the survival of the fellowship for all these years, the fact that it continues forward, reflects this. Um, and I think for the influence of Lady Olivia, I would say it's the power of positivity to advance the things you wish to do. Some people think you have to be negative to get results. That is not by any means true. You can be very positive and still get the good results that you want, even in times of conflict. Because I saw Olivia handle a number of conflicts, and um, she handled them in a very good way that never saw her lower herself into into negative actions. Doesn't mean she didn't understand what was going on, doesn't mean she didn't take the necessary actions to protect her organization and its members, but she was very particular how she did it. And I felt I learned a great deal from Olivia. Many other people did as well. Of all the pagan leaders, and I'll use the term pagan, although, as I say, um, I think she would have said goddess centered. But of all the leadership that I have known, I think she is the most revered in her posterity. And of course, she passed on a number of years ago. And she continued to be extremely active right up into her 90s and would come to, she would make an international tour every year um, up until nearly the end of her life. Things that a schedule a younger person could probably not have kept. It was amazing. Those are the two best known people that I want to remark on because they're both very well remembered, particularly within their organizations, which are still strong and still thriving. But there are a couple of other people I want to mention who I don't think you will recognize, and I'm not quite sure what all to say about that. Um, but I think they're people who should be remembered. And the first one is Donna Lyon Rose. Donna Lyon Rose, when I knew her, was the publisher and the editor of a magazine called Seasonal Silver. And this was a magazine of poems and stories, um, largely of her own creation, but also other submissions as well. I did a lot of artwork for it. It was a lovely magazine. Of all the people I have known creating pagan songs and poetry, I have always considered her to be the very best of them. Her work was beautiful, remarkable, and her writing, her fiction works were also um, beautiful stories. She had written a series on the period of the coming of Christianity at the age of the end of the classical world in Britain specifically, that dealt with a group of druids and bards, um, primarily bards during that time of transition. And it was fascinating. I don't know where you'd find it now. I don't know where you'd find her poetry now. There may still be some place that preserves it, but um, not that I know of. And, when I look at that, I think, what a tragedy. All that talent, those beautiful works, not preserved in our community. Um, and in fact, I don't know how they could be preserved because I have no idea where the copyrights went with her death. I have no idea who would be in a position to republish them, um, even if anyone wished to do so. And most likely they went to relatives who may not even know any of this exists. When I knew Donna, she lived in the area of Atlanta, Georgia, but she was totally reclused from the local community. She was very disenchanted with political experiences she had had in the community. And, unlike Lord Pete or Lady Olivia, she was not heading an organization. And this is part of why her legacy is largely lost. She was a lovely person. Um, in her way, also a huge mentor to me, a close friend at the time. We did a lot of work together. Um, I published some of those stories we were talking about at that time. Um, and it gives me great sadness to know that her legacy has not really survived. And so if you are a pagan artist, if you are a pagan creator, I would take this time to say to you, make sure that your work is going to survive you, because there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. Just because you did wonderful work. So many of the creators I worked with then, no one would know their name today. No one could find their work today. Um, and given the state of technology, most of this never got online. Things that are online, they may be there forever. Um, Although I think that in terms of accessibility is a bit of an optimistic assumption, because I can think of lots of things that have been online that you can't find now. But so many of these people, they worked in very perishable materials, and I don't know where you would find even original copies of this work. Seasonal Silver was a successful magazine. There were many people who were reading it within the context of the pagan press. But that means maybe 100 copies of each one were created. Really successful pagan zines might be in a couple of hundred copies at the time. There were standout exceptions like Circle Network News, which certainly does survive. But so many of these little ones, they just don't. And there was so much interesting material in them. And in some cases, such wonderful artwork, such wonderful poetry that's lost to the future. And when talking about friends on the other side that I have known, most of them are going to come under that heading. And so, what I would say to you is, if you have a chance ever to read the poems and the stories of Donna Lyon Rose, I highly recommend you take that chance. They were wonderful. And Jan in the chat room says your window art at the World of Witches Museum in Salem in 2010 was beautiful. Thank you, Jan. And hello to Brenda in the chat room. We had a painted window at that museum. There are still photos of it, and it showed several different, I guess we'd say, stereotypes of witches, um, but in what I thought was a very beautiful arrangement. Um, but this is another example of artwork that was temporal. It was a painted window. Of course, it itself does not survive, but there are photos in our um, our resources where you can still see it. With Donna Lyon-Rose, as I say, I don't know where you'd find records of her work. Another person I would like to mention is Merlin the Enchanter, otherwise known as L. Edward Lawrence, Larry Lawrence. And this was the person who did the Grave Robbers Gazette magazine and who ran the Lawrence Museum of Witchcraft in its later years. Um, the Lawrence Museum was started by Lydia Beckett and Italo Lawrence in the 1930s. Lydia Beckett was a cousin of Caroline Heikerel, either by blood or by affinity. I couldn't tell you with certainty either way. So there was a familial connection there. To the best of my knowledge, I am the only person who has a visual record of things that were in that museum because we did do a photo story of the museum shortly before it closed. It was open for 50 years. The Grave Robbers Gazette was a popular zine. It had lots of subscribers. It had fascinating things in it. I don't know where you'd find it today. I'm sure it's probably survives in someone's morgue of old works, but I don't know. I have a little bit of it. The Grave Robbers Gazette included spells in some cases from quite old books because the Lawrence family collected old books. It included stories about the museum from over the years, and Lawrence was, despite using the name Merlin the Enchanter, he was not remotely in the closet. The instructions that he would give out to people who wanted to come to the museum was ask anyone in town, they'll tell you where it is. The entire town of the Galveston, Indiana knew where the Lawrence Museum was, knew what it was, and knew that a bunch of witches lived there, and had for a very long time. It was a fascinating museum. It included relics of Aleister Crowley, included relics of the Voodoo Queen of Kokomo from the early part of the 20th century, including a magnificent mirror. There's a fascinating story behind those particular relics about how the family were frightened of the legacy of this woman, and they wanted to get rid of her pieces as quickly as they could. And they called Reginald Lawrence, who was then running the museum, to come and pick them up immediately after she died. And in some cases, they'd already painted over the magical symbols that she had painted on some of these items, but others were still as they had been. And it was just fascinating to see these things. They also had at the Lawrence Museum um, museum pieces that could have been in any museum. There was an Aztec high priest's necklace, for example, that could just have easily had been in any museum you might have gone to. There were remains of a 5,000-year-old um, burial of what was believed to be a shamaness, and a fascinating story behind how it came to be at the Lawrence Museum. But they were a fully recognized, legally recognized museum. They could handle historical artifacts like any other museum, and they did. Now, having said that, you walk into this place, and it was bizarre. It was full of fascinating, meaningful objects and absolute junk right next to each other. It was one room had 100 umbrellas hanging upside down from the ceiling. That kind of describes the place. But who today remembers Merlin the Enchanter? Who today remembers the Lawrence Museum? I have been told that there are people who would very much like to see my photographs, which I would love to share, um, because they've heard of this museum, but never seen any evidence that it was there, which is interesting to me because it was heavily covered by local press. But you'd have to know, I guess, where to find that. I do know where to find it. You would find it in, I believe, the library in Galveston, Indiana, where I believe the morgue of the local newspaper is maintained. Um, but this has disappeared completely from the history of American paganism. People just don't remember this very prominent pagan family from the early part of the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, with fascinating stories and lots of evidence in the local newspaper that they were there. um, but it's been totally written out of what most people know. This is why I say we must, those of us who are creators, those of us who are artists, those of us who have done work, we need to be mindful of what will and will not be remembered. We need to have a plan for our posterity, or we too will be forgotten. In my mind, if the Lawrence Museum can be forgotten, anything can be forgotten because it was so very public and so very well attested. But with that, I see we've come to the end of our half hour. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. Tomorrow is going to be a best of Reverend Don because I'm going to be appearing at a Valentine's Day event at the Earth at the here in Danville, and at the Earth Spirit Emporium, where I read on Saturdays. So if you're in the Danville area, consider coming out for that tomorrow. It will be open until early evening. You can get a reading with me. You can get a couples reading with me for Valentine's. There is also an art display and an art project going on, so it's going to be a lovely time. But with that, let us close the show with our prayer as we always do. And Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we ask you to help us to be mindful of that which has come before us and that which will come after us, and to help us to be mindful of our own role in the continuing progression of history. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we know you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always.